When you think of ancient warfare, you probably imagine chaos, screaming warriors, wild charges, swords clashing everywhere. That's what Hollywood shows you. But that's not how ancient battles worked. The truth was far more calculated and far more brutal. Ancient generals didn't just throw men at each other hoping for the best. They made actual systems, formations that were drilled that became muscle memory, movements that was coordinated with near perfect timing. These strategies were tested for centuries with warfare. The difference between victory or death came down to details: how well your line held under pressure, how fast you could shift formations, whether the troops understood the role in a much larger scale. So today I'm walking you through the tactics that actually won wars. These are real formations, with examples from actual battles where thousands of lives hung in that balance. Let's start with one of the most famous and most misunderstood formations in military history. The Greek phalanx wasn't just a formation. It was this warfare that dominated the Mediterranean for centuries. First, it appeared around 7th century BCE and evolved through the classical period. So try to picture the phalanx itself. It was 8 men deep, sometimes more, standing shoulder to shoulder in ranks so tight you could barely move independently. Each soldier, called a hoplite, held a round bronze shield called a hoplon, roughly 3 feet across, overlapping with the man next to him. The front row wielded the dory, an 18-foot spear with an iron point, all angled forward toward the enemy like a force of death. But the flanks wasn't static. The rear ranks pushed forward with their shields, driving the front line into the enemy. At the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE, Greek phalanxes held firm against the superior Persian forces. The Persians had cavalry, they had archers, they had mobility, but when the Spartans and Athenians formed up in phalanx, the Persian infantry couldn't break through. After the Greeks retreated strategically to rougher terrain, the Persians thought they'd won and crossed the Aspus River in pursuit. That's when the Spartans' flanks stopped retreating and turned in to fight. The longer spears, heavier swords, and this rigid discipline of this phalanx formation gave the Greek hoplites overwhelming advantages at close quarters. The Persian infantry, with their lighter wicker shields and shorter weapons, were cut down in mass. But the phalanx had a fatal weakness. It was inflexible. The rough terrain could break formation. If your flank got turned or your line was disrupted, the whole formation could collapse. And once the flanks broke, it became a massacre. Head on against infantry force on flat ground? Nearly unstoppable. Against a mobile, adaptive enemy? This is where Rome came in.
One eternity later.
The Romans looked at the Greek phalanx and saw the flaws. It was too rigid and too vulnerable to disruption. So they did something revolutionary. They broke their army into small, flexible units called maniples. Each maniple was roughly 120 men strong, arranged in a checkerboard pattern called a quincunx formation. This gave the Roman army something unprecedented: flexibility. If a unit got exhausted or overwhelmed, they could retreat through the gaps in their checkerboard and allow the troops to step forward in place. The manipular system divided infantry into 3 types: Hasse in the front, princesses behind them, and terrae as the veterans in the rear. Before engaging, the soldiers would hurl their pila, heavy javelins designed to bend on impact so enemies couldn't throw them back to weigh them down with shields, making them useless. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, Rome deployed roughly 80,000 men in a deeper than usual formation. They were trying to replicate their earlier success at Trebia by smashing through Hannibal's center. The Romans pressed their maniples so close together that they represented a phalanx more than your typical formation. This was a mistake. Hannibal had studied Roman tactics. He knew they would push hard in the center. So, he let them push. His line bent backwards in a crescent formation, while his African heavy infantry on the flanks held firm. Then his cavalry rushed the Roman horsemen and swung around to attack from behind. The Romans were trapped in a pocket with no room to maneuver. Despite the disaster at Cannae, the manipular system itself wasn't the problem. The problem was abandoning its flexibility. When properly deployed with space between the units, the maniples allowed Rome to adapt and basically rotate fresh troops, making them even harder to fight against. This same system helped Rome conquer the Mediterranean. One of the oldest and most devastating tactics in warfare, the hammer and anvil. The concept was brutally simple. Fix the enemy in place with a strong force, the anvil. Then strike at their vulnerable flank or rear with a faster or more mobile force. Alexander the Great perfected this at the Battle of Gaugamela on October 1st, 331 BCE. He commanded about 47,000 troops against Darius III's Persian army, which modern estimates place around 50,000 to 120,000 soldiers. The Persian had cavalry, even war elephants and scythed chariots. Alexander positioned his Macedonian flanks in the center, the Anvil. This was his holding force, designed to absorb the Persian assault and keep them locked in place. On his right wing, Alexander led his companion, a cavalry, the elite shock troops of his army, roughly 1,800 horsemen in wedge formations. As the battle developed, Alexander feigned a flanking movement to his right, stretching the Persian line thin. When a gap opened in the Persian center, Alexander saw it. He personally led a cavalry charge directly against Darius. He smashed through the Persian royal guard. That charge was successful as the Persian center collapsed. Darius fled the battlefield and his army's morale was shattered. Timing was everything. If the hammer struck too soon, it risked destruction alone. Too late and the anvil might break under pressure. Only the most disciplined, professional armies could execute this perfectly. But when it worked, the results were devastating. It was shown with this masterful general in the past. Few maneuvers in military history demonstrate the pure military might like Hannibal's double envelopment at Cannae in 216 BCE. Hannibal arranged his troops in a crescent formation, bulging forward in the center. He placed his weakest troops, Gauls and Iberians, at this bulge. His strongest forces, African heavy infantry, were on the flanks, hidden and waiting. The Romans saw this formation and believed Hannibal had made a mistake. Their deep column of 80,000 infantry pushed forward, confident they would break through the weak center. But at first, it seemed to work. The Carthaginian center actually gave ground, bending backward. The Romans pushed deeper, thinking this was victory within reach. But Hannibal had planned this. As the Romans pressed forward, the crescent inverted. The African infantry on the flanks swung inward, closing around the Roman sides. Meanwhile, Hannibal's cavalry had crushed the Roman horsemen on both wings and now charged into the Roman rear. The Romans were surrounded, trapped in a deadly pocket with no room to fight effectively. Shoulder to shoulder, unable to use their weapons properly, they were cut down by the thousands. Ancient historian Polybius described how the Romans found themselves pressed so tightly together they couldn't even raise their arms. By the end of the day, estimates suggest 50,000 to 70,000 Romans were killed. 20% of the Roman fighting men died between ages 13 to 50 at Cannae. Hannibal wasn't a lucky dude or anything. It was literally just due to his execution in the battlefield and his intelligence and strategy. Hannibal had turned the Romans' own strength and aggression against them. Nomadic armies from the steppes perfected one of the most psychologically devastating tactics in warfare: the feigned retreat. Pretend to flee in panic, break formation, and bait the enemy into a reckless pursuit, then turn around and destroy them. This tactic worked because it exploited the human psychology. Nothing causes more chaos than a false sense of victory. When you're thinking you're winning, discipline breaks down, as soldiers start to chase for glories and your formation is stretched thin and it becomes disorganized. And that's what happens when this trap closes. At the Battle of Kalka River on May 31st, 1223, Mongol generals Jebe and Subutai used this tactic to annihilate such a larger Russian army. The Rus princes, including Mstislav III of Kiev, Mstislav of Galicia, and others, raised an army of roughly 80,000 men in alliance with the Cumans, a Turkic nomadic people. The Mongols, numbering about only 20,000 cavalry, first clashed with the Russian scouts. When the Russians attacked, the Mongols retreated. For 9 straight days, they appeared to flee eastward across the steppe, leaving only a small rear guard, about 1,000 men, under Hamabek. Mstislav of Galicia crushed this rear guard, and, emboldened by this easy victory, pursued even harder. This coalition believed they were chasing a broken, defeated enemy, but the Mongols were deliberately luring them deeper into the steppe, stretching the Russian forces over miles of open ground. By the time the Russians actually reached the Kalka River, the army was disorganized. They were exhausted and were too overconfident in their abilities. Then, the Mongols turned. The Mongol cavalry wheeled around and attacked the coalition head-on and from the flanks with devastating ferocity. The Cumans, seeing the full Mongol force for the first time, panicked and fled. Their retreat caused the chaos in the Russian ranks and swept the Mongols through the gap this created. Using their composite recurve bows, capable of penetrating armor at 300 meters, Mongol horse archers unleashed their volleys into the packed Russian formations. Then their heavy cav charged, shattering what remained. The Russians were surrounded, cut off from retreat, and literally slaughtered. Now, according to Russian chronicles, at least 90% of the coalition forces were killed at Kalka or during the subsequent pursuit. The 3 Russian princes were later captured and then executed. The feigned retreat had turned what looked like a Russian victory into one of the worst military disasters in history. This tactic would be used again and again by steppe armies throughout history. This worked because it required the perfect discipline from the retreating force and exploited the lack of discipline in the pursuing one. For centuries, Greek warfare followed strict conventions. You formed your flanks with your best troops on the right wing. But both sides advanced and one pushed until one side broke. It was simple and often decided whoever had the more men or the better soldiers. Then Epaminondas of Thebes broke all of those rules. At the Battle of Leuctra on July 6, 371 BCE, Epaminondas faced a massive problem. His Theban army of roughly 6,000 to 9,000 men was outnumbered by King Cleombrotus' Spartan's forces of about 10,000 to 11,000, including the legendary Spartan hoplites who hadn't lost a major battle in living memory. They were fighting the traditional way, which meant certain defeat. So Epaminondas did something unprecedented. He completely inverted the standard formation, which is called oblique order. So instead of placing his best troops on the right, he packed them on the left wing with a column 50 men deep. This was the Sacred Band, an elite unit of 300 warriors Herod couples, led by Blooperz. The normal flanks was 8 to 12 men deep. Epaminondas made his left wing 50 shields deep. Then he deliberately weakened his center and right flank, ordering them to advance slowly at an angle, holding back from contact with the Spartan line. This created a diagonal formation where only his left wing would engage the enemy at full strength, while the rest of his army stayed screened by cavalry and right troops. The plan was risky. If the Spartans broke through his weak right flank before his left wing would win, the entire Theban army would be surrounded and destroyed. But Epaminondas bet everything on the overwhelming odds of the Spartan right wing, where King Cleombrotus commanded with his elite 300-man Hippolytes bodyguard. The sacred band crashed into the Spartan line with overwhelming force. The sheer might and depth of the 50 ranks dove through the 12-deep Spartan formation like a battering ram. King Cleombrotus was killed in the fighting. His death shattered the Spartan morale. Once the Spartan right had collapsed, Epaminondas wheeled his victorious left wing into the rest of the Spartan line. The Spartans, seeing their king dead and their flank destroyed, broke and fled. Of the 700 full Spartan citizens at Leuctra, 400 were killed. The total Spartan losses reached around 1,000 to 2,000 men. The Theban casualties were actually light. The Oblique order had worked perfectly. This battle did not just end the Spartan military dominance, it helped the Greek warfare, as the Oblique order showed that the concentration of force at a decisive point could defeat numerical superiority. Refusing your weak flank while attacking with your strong one became a fundamental tactical principle. Philip II of Macedon studied in Thebes and learned these tactics directly. His son Alexander would use variations of the Oblique order and the concentration of force to conquer the known world. The innovations that won at Leuctra echoed through the military history towards this day. Even in the modern world, in the age of using drones, the cyber warfare, making sure that strikes are precise, controlling the supply lines and maintaining terrain, coordinating timing all together is still crucial today. Ancient warfare was never about this chaos. It was about the order that was drilled into these soldiers through relentless training and commanded by generals who understood that victory didn't come from bravery alone. It came from systems, the tactics, from understanding that war is not won by the strongest, but by the smartest. Now, if you learned something from this video, please subscribe. That would help a lot. I might have more videos coming soon if you're interested in that, but I'll see you later. See ya. Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! Burn!